Hey guys, welcome to my channel and welcome to another IB related video. Today we are again talking about IB psychology. If you didn't check out my previous video, you should definitely do that first, because in that video I talk about using spaced repetition and active recall to keep all those theories and studies fresh in my mind, and that's a big part of how I studied for short answer questions, but it's also important for long answer questions. So check that out first, and this video is kind of a continuation. It's the part 2. So in this video, I'm going to be covering how I studied for long answer questions. I'm going to talk about kind of how I improved my long answer writing and how I brainstorm, make notes, or rather outlines for my essays. So yeah, stick around if you're interested in that. So a big part of IB psychology is evaluative and critical thinking, and that's tested in long answer questions mainly. Now, earlier in my first year, I remember that I was so worried, I was so nervous that I wouldn't be able to come up with a coherent evaluation or discussion under the stringent time limits of exams. So I literally thought that the safest approach was to basically memorize entire paragraphs of evaluation. Yeah, so for one of my first in-class tests that was on brain imaging, I remember that I literally wrote and memorized an entire essay, and then I regurgitated that out during the exam. And in the beginning of the first year, the classes were still kind of progressing at a leisurely pace, so that was sort of manageable. But as you can imagine, as soon as we picked up speed, yeah, that didn't last long. And the other big problem is that these essays just weren't that good, because I was still new to the course. I was new to long answer questions, the rubric, what's expected in the type of evaluative writing that's expected. Yeah, I was new to all that, and that's normal, that's fine, that's expected. If you're at that stage, yeah, that's perfectly fine. But then, of course, what's the point of memorizing an essay that isn't actually that good and that may not actually score you that high of a mark, right? So I had to find a better way, and what I tried next was that I basically tried to type out or write out entire responses to all possible exam questions, but I didn't memorize them. I would just kind of read through them a few times before the exam, and that was still kind of manageable back when we didn't have too many exams and tests, and when those tests were given, they just covered a small portion of the syllabus. So that was still kind of manageable, and those are definitely useful and good practice. And I would recommend that you do write out essays by hand once in a while. However, writing out essays for all possible long answer questions that could potentially appear on the IB exams, it just wasn't feasible. And in my second year, the deadlines, obviously, they came crashing down, and the research studies, the theories, they all came and they piled up. So that's when I kind of had to change my approach to revision for long answer questions. And what I basically did was I made essay outlines, and this was a process. So I would first do an evaluation of the theory on my own, using notes from class, and then kind of reflecting on that. Sometimes I will use teacup, if you've ever heard about that. And that's just to kind of get me thinking from various perspectives. But I didn't always use that. And sometimes I did also draw on my understanding from other slightly related topics that we had just covered, because yeah, sometimes they are relevant and they might shed a new light on the topic that you're trying to evaluate right now. And then I would then do a bit of research. I would kind of try to gather points of evaluation from reading websites, from my textbook, from in-thinking. And then in my head, I would kind of evaluate each evaluation point. So basically, I would be asking myself these questions. I would be thinking about, okay, so I have an evaluation point here. How relevant is it to actually answering the command term that I'm given? Can I think of any real-life examples? What is its significance in the context of this specific theory or concept that I'm discussing? And that's really important. It's super important to contextualize any evaluation point that you bring up, and you link it to the specific theory or the researches that are used to study it. So for example, I could mention sample size. Maybe it's too small. I could mention the sample not being generalizable to other cultures. I could talk about the age of the sample, researcher bias, demand characteristics, the list goes on. But if I look at the bigger picture, would this particular evaluation point contribute anything substantial to the development of my essay's argument? So I would kind of ask myself that. And so for example, if we're talking about pheromones and we're discussing Cutler, Fragment, and McCoy's research, maybe the participants, they may have been able to suspect the true aim of the research because they were asked to take note of those 6 behaviors, in combination with the fact that the researchers were basically trying to change something about their body odor, right? So that's kind of a relevant and contextualized point. So how about the sample? Maybe it was all male, but were there any similar studies on females? So you could look that up online, or you could check your textbook. And sometimes an evaluation point could be relevant, but maybe it wasn't actually so significant of a concern in the research study that I'm using because of the way that the research is designed, or maybe there's supporting research on other samples, or maybe, yes, it's a weakness, but it may not actually impact the study's findings that much. So if I thought that it wasn't a point that I could actually expand on, and because it wasn't really consequential to in the context of the specific theory or topic, I'll basically cross it out. And then I'm kind of left with these evaluation points that I thought that I could really develop and that were really relevant. And then I kind of thought deeply about these evaluation points in front of me, and I tried to develop them. So I would try to relate them to each other and build connections between ideas. So for example, maybe this idea from my textbook is actually an extension of one of my teacup ideas or builds on them. Or maybe this point challenges another point and kind of balances it out. Or from my reading, if there's contradictory evidence, for example, there's a later research that kind of challenges an earlier study's findings, are they reconcilable? And if not, what is the implication of this in terms of our understanding of the theory? And if there's a limitation in research design, is it kind of like a common thread across researches in this area? Or if there's maybe the phenomenon is really, something about the phenomenon is difficult to investigate experimentally and it can't be directly observed. So animal models or correlational methods are typically used in research. Or maybe there's a limitation in the first study that I used in my essay that's not present in the second research that I'm using because of a difference in research design. Or maybe are the researches that I'm using outdated? So you don't necessarily have to change a research just because it's old. You could evaluate that, and of course, don't use studies that are too old. And you can check with your teacher. They can definitely help you. Yeah, just see if this is appropriate research to use. And basically, in this way, I started arranging my ideas into one coherent discussion. It's almost like a podcast conversation developing in my mind. So, in a conversation, a person might make a statement and then the other person would respond to it. And the two people may build on each other's ideas. One may bring up a new perspective that the previous one hadn't considered, or they may bump head to head, or maybe the conversation just sort of ends in an inconclusive stalemate. Whatever it is, asking myself these questions really helped me to move beyond a superficial and generic surface evaluation. And it importantly kind of forced me to really think deeply and about the topic. And as I thought hard about it, that really enhanced my recall of the topic, of the theory, and then of the evaluation itself. So the point is, evaluation isn't really like a checklist. You don't have the space or time to mention a little bit of every single thing. So you want to pick a few strong points of evaluation that can really demonstrate your critical thinking to the examiner, and then you want to develop them. So let me give you an example. Let's say we're talking about neuroplasticity. Let's say the question is discuss neuroplasticity or something like that. And I choose to use Dragansky's research and McGuire's research. And okay, so I might notice that both of these studies, they use MRI. So even though the essay is about neuroplasticity, I could briefly discuss MRI because it's being used to study neuroplasticity, right? But of course, be careful to stay focused on the topic. You don't want to be evaluating MRI and going off track. And okay, so back to the example. Let's say, okay, so the high spatial resolution of such brain imaging technology, they can allow researchers to non-invasively study neuroplasticity, right? Before this, if you think about it, researchers were probably using animal models. They were probably autopsying lab rats to study neuroplasticity. But with MRI, the researchers can measure slight changes in gray matter in the brain of human participants, right? And yes, a common limitation of MRI is probably that it only provides a static image of the brain anatomy. So maybe this research findings might be correlational, right? Well, not necessarily. If you think about the specific design of Dragansky's research, they used a pre-test, post-test experimental design, and this basically allowed them to infer a cause and effect influence wherein the environmental stimulation is likely causing the changes in gray matter and not the other way around. So not every research that uses MRI is automatically subject to the same limitations. Just keep that in mind. And okay, but then Dragansky's research, it's also a field experiment, right? So participants, they're not in the lab. They were going on with their regular lives for a few months while which the researchers obviously couldn't control. So during that time, maybe they could have been involved in some other brain stimulating activities. So wouldn't it be kind of reductionist to conclude that the changes in gray matter are solely in response to only one stimulus in isolation? And if we're talking about McGuire's research, this time it's a quasi-experiment, right? And on the one hand, we could definitely make a case for bidirectional ambiguity. But on the other hand, they did also find that the posterior hippocampus volume is correlated with the number of years of taxi driving. And that seems to suggest a causation. Okay, so that's an exciting finding. But wait, if learning the skill is associated with the growth in gray matter in a specific brain region, does that necessarily indicate that the region's size correlates to the aptitude in that skill in general? So could we MRI a person's brain for changes in their gray matter and make predictions about the extent to which there's like a functional difference? So, these are kind of the questions that you might want to be asking yourself. So after I had done all this brainstorming and then I had selected the best points that I wanted to mention, I then organized these points concisely and logically in my notebook, and I did this by hand. My outline, it basically consisted of, so I would write intro, study 1, discussion or evaluation, study 2, discussion or evaluation, and then conclusion. And of course, I don't always use this structure. It really does depend on the question, but this is just a general framework for what I usually use. And for the intro, I usually just left it blank. Yeah. But sometimes I would also, in point form, I would write out the key information that I wanted to mention, especially if it was an animal extension or abnormal psychology question. And then for study 1 and study 2, I literally just write researcher year because I basically already knew the research based using my active recall, spaced repetition, flashcards, which I mentioned in my previous video. And for the evaluation and discussion paragraphs, for these sections in my outline, this is where I put like all the results of my brainstorming. So I would write out my first main discussion point, and then I would have an arrow below it as to indicate a further development of or a response to that main point. And then I usually only have a few main points, as I mentioned. And really importantly, I try to write as concisely as possible. I use a lot of abbreviations and shortcuts, often just ones that I made up. And articles, prepositions, grammar, all those words, they just go out the window. And this really forces me when I'm revising to read actively as I fill in the gaps instead of like passively skimming through. And really importantly, the points are organized in a very logical order. And these like arrows, they physically allow me to visualize the development and the progression of the argument. And this is what makes it so much easier to remember compared to like paragraphs. Not only are there much fewer words, but seeing how the argument develops with these arrows, it just helps me so much. And it also shows me that I'm not like trying to memorize a bunch of different and unrelated points, but these points are all connected, they're all related, they're kind of responding to each other. And yes, I eventually made an outline like this for basically every question that could potentially come up on the IB exams. Sometimes even if it's the same topic but different command terms, I will still do it. And for my IB exams, that's how I basically studied. Like I basically prepared for all my long answer questions by making these outlines and then revising with them. And how I revised is I basically I read, but not passively, just like looking over all that, but instead I used the concise points in my outlines as guidelines. And I kind of verbalize my essay out loud. I speak to myself as I go along. And this is really helpful because it's actually just active recall, because I intentionally leave out a lot of like words. I leave out some blanks. I put ... to kind of like prompt myself to continue with the thought. And this forces me to like actively engage with the material and make sure that I'm writing an essay basically, but instead of on hand, I'm just saying it with my mouth because it's so much faster. And that's basically how I was studying for my long answer questions in the weeks leading up to my exams. Sometimes I also use highlighters and extra colors in my outlines. Yeah, sometimes it helps, but that's not like the key part. The key part is really the process of brainstorming for these outlines and thinking really deeply about them, and then kind of testing myself but verbalizing it. So because that saved a lot of time. Once in a while, I did write out entire essays by hand under timed conditions, which I would recommend because you do want to get a feel of the length of the paragraphs that you can feasibly accomplish or you can feasibly manage under the time constraints of the exam. And you want to see whether you're writing too much or too little, or whether you're including too many details in your description of the research, which I often did. So that was super helpful. If you frequently have like timed in-class tests or like mock exams, you should be fine. But I did have it in class, but I also, in addition to that, kind of wrote my own essays by hand. Yeah, just for some extra practice, but that's up to you. Yeah, so that's kind of how I study for long answer questions. And I can tell you that in the beginning, my evaluations, they definitely looked very similar. They were generic, they were shallow, and I did mention like a bit of everything. I talked about sample size, the study's generalizability to other populations, demand characteristics, etc. And I did that instead of expanding more thoroughly on a few but highly relevant discussion points. And I also didn't link the evaluation points to each other or to the understanding of the larger theory or phenomenon that we're talking about. So my idea of what an essay was supposed to be structured like was definitely quite fixed. But definitely you're going to learn, you're going to improve. Don't worry. It's all going to be fine. In the beginning, I often felt like I didn't know what I was doing. But that's okay. You are going to get used to writing under pressure. There is enough time to come up with a good evaluation, even in exams, without having to memorize paragraphs. And you are going to significantly improve in your evaluations and critical thinking. And it was just that in the beginning, I didn't really understand yet how the evaluation is supposed to contribute to the entire development of an argument or a discussion, but really that solved itself out. As you continue to pay attention in class, as you continue to, read around the topic, and as you continue to revise by active recall, but also try to evaluate and look at what other people have come up with in terms of evaluation, it's going to come to you. And it's going to come to you with practice if you basically you think about what you're learning and you pay attention in class and you read your textbook. And I should stress again that it is important to review and study with spaced repetition, which I talked about in my previous video, because it is going to be difficult to evaluate a theory or a study if you can't even remember what it is, or if you keep forgetting about it. So that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you found it helpful. And subscribe, and please feel free to comment down below. I'm really open to your suggestions. Feel free to give me feedback on my video or ask questions if there's something you're wondering about based on something I talked about in this video, or just any questions in general. Feel free to leave them down below. I hope you guys enjoyed it. See you next time. Bye.